Okay, I think we're back and I think we're recording now, so we should be able to get started. So first we'll talk about the biology and mechanisms, and then we'll talk a little bit about what concussion recovery looks like, and then we'll talk briefly about persisting symptoms and what that means, and then we'll finish up talking about some kind of the future directions in concussion care and research. So first we'll talk about the anatomy of the brain. The brain sits in a fluid called cerebral spinal fluid, which is important for bringing nutrients to the brain and also carrying waste away from the brain. But it also provides a little bit of structural support in terms of kind of like additional padding. So I have an experiment here with an egg, and I haven't tried this, so I really hope it works. But essentially, this is an egg in water, and I can shake it around and it doesn't rattle too much. It doesn't break. We've got our egg in water. And now if I pour the water out, again, hopefully this experiment works. And now we no longer have our cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. And we shake it up, you see that the egg has cracked. So this is the importance of cerebral spinal in the brain. Not only does the cerebral spinal fluid provide a little bit of support to the brain, but we also have important kind of anchoring material called the meninges. And there's 3 specific layers of the meninges. The most outermost layer that that's attached to the actual skull is called the dura mater, which means tough mother. And that's because it's kind of this tough fibrous layer that connects directly to the skull. And then the part of the meninges that is on the actual brain itself is called the pia mater, which means soft mother. And between those is a web-like layer called the arachnoid. And the arachnoid layer is also where kind of the cerebral spinal fluid lives. So it provides a barrier between that tough mother and the soft mother layers. So those are really important for anchoring the brain to the skull in a way to prevent it from moving around. Because as we'll see, the brain is like Jello, and it is an extremely soft material, and it will actually eventually kind of collapse in on itself if it weren't for these structural supports that it had. And so when someone gets a concussion, the force is kind of overcomes that protective barrier around it, and 2 things can happen. You can have linear acceleration, which is sort of in one direction and causes the brain to actually jiggle and possibly hit the skull. But a more damaging mechanism is caused by rotational impact, rotational acceleration. And this actually stretches and compresses the axons and the tissue of the brain, and it will transmit force to the deep brain structures. And this can happen from any impact to the body, the neck, or the head. And again, that rotational impact kind of transmits these forces down to those deep brain structures. This is individual. Every single concussion is slightly different from the next, but there are some structures that are commonly seen. They're predicting based on models that these are involved in concussion, and that includes the thalamus, which is an important relay station. You can think of it as the post office. It takes incoming signals, sensory signals from the periphery, and sends it to the part of the brain that is needed. So that's what the thalamus is important for. And then we also have the corpus callosum, which is made of a series of axons, white matter tracts that connect the 2 brain hemispheres together and enable it to speak to one another. So these are 2 very important structures that they're believing possibly could be damaged during concussion. So what exactly is happening to the cell? Well, what we see is something called diffuse axonal injury. So here I have a picture of a neuron. This is the cell body, and these are the dendrites, the kind of short incoming projections. So this is where information is received. And then the cell body will actually send a signal down along the axon, which is this long projection. And this is really important for signal transduction. So when you get injury to this axon, we see kind of dysfunction in the neuron. We're going to take a closer look at what the actual membrane looks like for the neuron. So this is a zoomed in picture of a neuron. We have an extracellular environment and an intracellular environment. And these like to be maintained at very specific ways. The intracellular environment is very particular about how many ions are in there, what the charges are, etc. So in order to make that happen, we have a very important player here, the sodium-potassium pump. So what the sodium-potassium pump does is it pumps sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. How I remember this is the symbol for potassium is K. K in is like kin. We're kinesiology students. So K in is what the pump does. So the goal is to create kind of a chemical gradient where you have a high concentration of potassium inside of the cell and a high concentration of sodium outside the cell. That way, when the specific doors for these ions open, we have one that just likes sodium, we have one that just likes potassium. Those ions will flow down their gradient from a concentration high to a concentration of low. So this is set up by the sodium-potassium pump, which uses ATP as its form of energy. So ATP is the energy currency of the cell and is created from the mighty mitochondria who convert glucose and use oxygen to make ATP and carbon dioxide. So the ATP uses quite a bit of energy in order to make this gradient possible. Another thing about the cell is you also have a high number of negative proteins inside of the cell. So this, combined with the specific concentrations, permits the inside to be more negative relative to the outside. And this is setting up kind of a resting membrane potential is what it's called. It's set like this. So when those doors open, sodium rushes in, making the inside more positive. And the potassium channels, they're a little slow to open. So they're a little delayed. And when they open, it enables potassium to flow out. So this is what that looks like. We have a resting membrane potential. So again, high concentration of potassium inside. Our sodium channels open. Sodium rushes into the cell, making it more positive. And then our potassium channels slowly open. Potassium rushes out. All the while, the sodium-potassium pump is working hard to get back to that resting membrane potential, to get back to the baseline state. One thing we didn't talk about is the concentration of calcium. So I'll just go back for a second, but you'll see here I've added some calcium ions outside of the cell, and that's to represent that the inside of the cell has very low concentration of calcium. And that's because calcium is a really important signaling molecule, and the cell really is particular about when it wants calcium inside. So what's going to happen when we have diffuse axonal injury? We have damage to this membrane. Well, we get these little tears in the membrane, and that causes sodium to rush out and calcium to rush in, and the ATP pump goes into overdrive. It is not liking the situation. It really wants to get back to that kind of baseline state. And so what it does is it pumps hard, but it needs a lot of ATP to do this. Remember, ATP is produced by the mitochondria. So now the mitochondria are needing to work harder. Okay, that sounds fine. But when someone has a concussion, there's actually a decrease in cerebral blood flow, and the blood is super important for carrying glucose and oxygen to the cell, to the mitochondria, in order to be able to produce this ATP. So we've got this mismatch in the supply and the demand. We need more ATP, and the mitochondria is not able to produce it because we're not getting enough glucose and blood to the brain. But remember that calcium. Calcium is problematic. Why? Because when it enters the cell's like, no, 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 no. You're not supposed to be here. You are here only for specific signaling reasoning, and I don't want to fire, and I don't want you here. So it stores it in the mitochondria. I'm just going to put it aside, deal with it later. So this is called sequestering. This is problematic because the mitochondria doesn't like calcium either. And so what happens is the mitochondria start to become dysfunctional. They're like, no, too much calcium. I can't do my job right. I can't convert the glucose into the ATP that you need. So I'm shutting down now too. Decrease glucose, decrease ATP leads to an energy crisis. So now we're dealing with an energy crisis in the cell. And this is why the brain is so vulnerable to a second impact after an initial injury, because we're already at this kind of decreased ability to function. And if we have more injury, it's going to lead to more problems. So this is a bit of a time scale of what we just talked about. I'm not going to worry about this stuff up here. I want to focus on these things down here, the cerebral blood flow and the glucose levels. So you can see that these levels remain low for over a week following injury. So someone might be feeling okay, but after that initial concussion, their brain is still in this vulnerable state for at least a week after the injury. And then again, you can see calcium levels are also relatively high for those first couple of days. So this is like a super critical period for when a second injury can be so damaging. And this is called second impact syndrome. And people have died from having multiple hits when they are already recovering from a concussion. So this is important because the sooner the diagnosis, the sooner the recovery. So if there's any kind of suspected concussion, somebody should seek medical attention so they can get started on that path to recovery. But what does diagnosing a concussion look like, you ask? Well, officially it's done by a physician in BC or a healthcare provider with relevant training and other places. But there are signs and symptoms that we can learn about that may indicate somebody has a concussion. So signs are what you can see and symptoms are what somebody feels. So what do we think some possible symptoms of concussion could be? Katie? Nausea. Maya? Headache. Any other ones? Nicole? Dizziness? Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. Great job. Yeah. So in addition to some of the ones mentioned here, we've got blurred or double vision, we've got fatigue, sensory sensitivity. So kind of the stars in front of your eyes, bright lights are irritating. And another big one are mental health related problems. This could be anxiety, depression, or any kind of other mood disturbances. So those are symptoms. That's what we feel. What could be some potential signs of concussion? What are some things that we could see that may indicate somebody has a concussion? This is a little bit harder to think about. It's easier than it seems, but Katie?
Vomiting.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, Tiffany. Okay, so what would disorientation look like?
Confused from where they are.
Okay. Gwen?
Either like gait is cut off.
Yeah, some stumbling. Nicole?
Yeah.
Consciousness. Actually, and consciousness we'll come back to. In concussions, actually less than 10% of people will actually end up losing consciousness for a concussion, but it is indicative of a more severe brain injury if it's for a longer period of time. So it's definitely covered on some ones here. Number one, an impact to the body or head. If somebody receives an impact to the head or body, maybe they have a possible concussion. I know when I'm watching hockey games, I'm watching people get slammed to the boards. It's the first thing that comes to my mind is, oh my gosh, they might have a concussion. Somebody who's slow to get up after a hit, maybe clutching the head in their hand, you're feeling some pain, stumbling, which was mentioned, and also slurred speech can be another indication. Not on here was mentioned vomiting. So I think that this is a little bit of a gray zone because nausea and vomiting aren't quite the same things. You can have somebody who's feeling nauseated, but repetitive vomiting can be indicative of something more severe. So these are our red flag signs and symptoms, and these can be an indication of a more severe brain injury. So this could include a loss of consciousness for an extended period of time, someone who has a seizure after a hit, something called tonic posturing. And this I didn't know about until I watched a video of somebody getting Cronwalled. Is that right? Cronwalled, where after a hit, the player's arms went up in the air like this. And so that's indication of a more severe brain injury. Someone who's experiencing amnesia, as was mentioned, that's probably more than a mild traumatic brain injury and more like a moderate traumatic brain injury. Tingling in the arms and legs can also be a red flag, and also somebody who's repeatedly vomiting. So these can indicate a more severe brain injury and should definitely warrant a visit to the eMERGE as soon as possible to get checked out. So what exactly does recovery look like, you ask? Well, so this is adapted from specifically from catonline.com, but these are kind of this is the current guidelines following a large international meeting from the Concussion and Sport group. They published this consensus statement who kind of went over these guidelines. This is specific to concussion and sport, so just keep that in mind, which we will kind of revisit in a minute here. But the first step is relative rest. So what does that look like? 24 to 48 hours of just kind of hanging out, still engaging in your activities of daily living. So this could include preparing meals or maybe cleaning, but not doing any kind of activity that's going to cause symptoms to get worse or overexert yourself. And also super important to avoid anything that could put someone at risk for another head injury. Limiting screen time is recommended within this period to reduce symptom severity over time. But after 48 hours, there isn't really strong evidence showing that reducing screen time has an impact. So just kind of that immediate time is the important for reducing screen time. And I have here mild and brief symptom exacerbation. So the reason that there's this kind of a range, this 24 to 48 hours, depends on injury severity. Because you can have somebody who's got they got a hit to the head, but they're feeling okay. And then you might have somebody who's got more severe injury and they should really be resting up to 2 days because their symptoms are so bad. So mild and brief symptom exacerbation, we're going to look at this scale down here. This is a symptom severity scale where number 1 is no symptoms and number 10 is the worst symptoms imaginable. And mild and brief symptom exacerbation is defined as no more than a 2-point increase on this scale for more than 1 hour. So if going for a walk doesn't make your headache worse than a 2-point increase, then it's okay to do that kind of within this period. But if you're feeling really, really bad, just maybe avoid anything that's going to exacerbate those symptoms beyond that kind of mild and brief extent. Next step, once you can do this, okay, light aerobic activity. So this is doing those same things, but now incorporating a little bit of aerobic activity, getting the heart rate up to about 55% of the age predicted range. And again, doing this in a safe and controlled environment. So this could be riding on a stationary bike, maybe just going for a walk outside. Again, to kind of just sit in that zone of mild and brief symptom exacerbation, but not going on beyond that. After a minimum of 24 hours, if that's okay, it's okay to move on to the next step. Essentially the same thing, but now we're looking at about 70% of meeting that maximum heart rate level. Now, this is not linear, and someone can be progressing well and then have to go backwards a step at any point in time. Someone might be stuck on one step for a couple of days. Again, every concussion is unique, and it kind of depends on what somebody is capable of for how they can progress. Getting to steps 4 and 5 requires medical clearance from a physician, because this is when you're going to be trying to get back up to those, increase your exercise intensity levels, get back up to that kind of pre-injury level. And if this is sports related, that might look like going back to practice, not doing contact drills, but being back into the team environment. And then finally, the final step is return to activity, return to sport, return to school full-time, return to work full-time, all those kinds of things. This is essentially kind of a full recovery. And again, we have this symptom scale to kind of guide how somebody progresses through there. I know what you're thinking. What about people who can't do this? Like, I don't normally go out and do 70% of my max heart rate on a daily basis. So what about these people? Well, this is a major limitation in the research, because so much of the research is focused on athlete populations. This guideline is from sports-related concussion. and is focused primarily on athletes. Also, you have to think about para athletes, and there's other types of populations who this may not be able to translate to. However, exercise is always a good thing. And remember, we have that decrease in blood and in the blood, cerebral blood flow for that kind of week and a half following concussion. So increasing your heart rate and encouraging more blood to get to the brain is not a bad thing. So even for someone who may not be physically active, it might not be a bad idea to try to do a little bit of light aerobic exercise. Again, maybe exacerbate the symptoms slightly, but not too much to kind of help them recover. And there's another thing that I've taken away from the research here, which I like to think of as kind of exposure therapy. So this is kind of referred to as habituation, which is this symptom exacerbation. If you're kind of pushing yourself a little bit more and a little bit more every day, you're not going to be as affected by your symptoms over a longer period of time because you're getting sort of used to them. If you think about any kind of active rehabilitation, if you injured a body part, like let's just say you broke your leg or something, you're not going to just sit there and do nothing for 6 weeks and then go out and start running. There's this kind of gradual progression to be able to gain strength, and that's sort of what this symptom exacerbation, the goal of that is. However, up to 30% of people will experience persisting symptoms, which is defined as symptoms lasting for longer than 3 weeks. So after 3 weeks, up to 95% of people might still have kind of a persisting headache. Up to 44% of people may be experiencing mental health related symptoms, and up to 15% of people will likely experience some symptoms of dizziness. The best treatment for these is to first seek out care from a physician and then talk to them about going to get referral for someone who may be better able to manage the symptoms. So for example, with a headache, a physician may initially recommend doing a little bit of like a headache tracking, kind of sort of a behavioral intervention, see what makes your symptoms worse, try to avoid that. And if that doesn't help, they may refer you to go to a physiotherapist to maybe do some manual therapy or manual manipulation of the spine. There's lots of different options. These are just a couple of examples. For mental health related symptoms, same thing. Maybe start with a little bit of mindfulness training exercises, and then a referral to maybe a psychologist to help with that. Dizziness, I did a whole project on dizziness and a form of vertigo called benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, or BPPV. And this is kind of a form of vertigo that can happen following a head injury or other reasons. And so one of the treatments is to seek a vestibulotherapist and do some vestibular therapy. If you're interested in learning about BPPV, let me know. I have a video I can send you. I'd be more than happy to share it. Problem here, and a problem with the research: headache, mental health related symptoms, dizziness. These are things that anyone can experience at any time. This does not necessarily mean that somebody has a headache because of a concussion. You may get a headache because you're a little bit dehydrated or you're stressed out. So there's sort of a limitation in the research that some people may attribute these symptoms to their concussion that they had previously, when in fact it's just because they need to drink a little bit more water, something like that. So something to keep in mind. However, there are certainly people who experience these persisting symptoms and should be referred to get additional care. Future directions. So where do we go? Where are we now? Injury prevention. Of course, prevention is key. My grandpa likes to say, an ounce of prevention leads to a pound of cure. And that is true in the fact that injury prevention is the #1 thing that you can do to prevent yourself from having injury. But sometimes injuries are inevitable. Concussions can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone. And the goal of the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit specifically is to help disseminate the most recent findings in the literature to diverse audiences, to audiences that can benefit from learning about proper recovery, proper care. Because of course, a lot of people think, I have a concussion, I'm just going to stay home and do nothing for like a week until I start to feel better. As we've seen, that might not necessarily be the best approach. Multidisciplinary care. So we just talked about kind of the importance of referral. And this is super important because the healthcare system right now is super overloaded and physicians may not be able to provide the most adequate care for people. In fact, right now in Canada, there's a push for the federal government to adapt a national strategy for brain injury. And what this means is making sure that less people kind of slip through the gaps that there currently are in the medical system, and that more people are able to seek the care that they need. So cooperation and communication between disciplines is super important. And finally, equity, diversity, and inclusion in research. This is super key. As we saw, the research right now is primarily based on sports-related concussion in athlete populations, also in active military personnel, possibly primarily Caucasian male demographics, and that's not necessarily representative of the entire population. This past summer, there was a public service announcement created in collaboration with Trevor Linden and the Vancouver YWCA on kind of the importance of this inclusion in research. And just a quote from that, for every NHL concussion, 7,000 Canadian women suffer concussions from an intimate partner. So just let that sit in for a second. NHL, sports, hockey, NFL, that's where the attention is for this research, but that might not necessarily be the populations who actually need the research the most. So including EDI in research is absolutely key. If you're interested in learning more, I will point you to catonline.com, where you can find the Concussion Awareness Training Tool, which is a platform that provides free online modules that are curated for various audiences. So this includes athletes, this includes coaches, this includes intimate people who work with partners of intimate violence and medical professionals. There's like 8 different modules: youth, parents, teachers, caregivers. Like there's a ton of information about kind of what we just talked about, but in a little bit more detail. And they also have tons of resources available, including a return to sport school work strategies, kind of return to learn plans. And that was what I kind of based my recovery slide off of. So thank you so much for your attention today. I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone for joining on Zoom today. Like I said, this is as part of my directed studies project. And I wrote an entire paper about it, a very long 40-page paper all about this. So if you're really, really keen on learning more, you can send me an email and I would be happy to share that paper with you once it's finished. And I think we'll do questions now. Katie.
I've heard from some sources like paramedics and such that if you suspect somebody has a concussion, you're not supposed to let them sleep for a certain period of time. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Absolutely. So the question was about concussions and sleep and a possible this kind of idea that someone shouldn't sleep after concussion because maybe they're gonna die when they sleep or something like that. That's kind of the ideas behind it. So that's false. That it was kind of something that people talked about a lot, and it's definitely something still floating around. But it's actually really important to get the rest that your body needs following any kind of injury. And if somebody is worried about going to sleep after a concussion, it's good to have somebody monitor them while they sleep. So just kind of looking, making sure they're not changing color or their skin isn't like cold and blue or anything like that. Just kind of keeping an eye on them while they sleep to make sure that something worse isn't happening. For a concussion, it's completely safe to sleep. For a more severe brain injury, I'm not going to speak to that. Again, I am not a doctor. Please don't take any of this and you know, take it at what it is. It's kind of an introduction to this topic. If you do have any questions, ask your doctor. But for sleep, I do know that it is safe to sleep. Quinn.
Yeah, I had a question about kind of elderly people and concussions.
Yeah.
Big issue in elderly people's small business results in concussions.
Absolutely.
Did you come across any research when you were doing this on like how concussions might present differently, how treatment might differ in like elderly?
Yeah, no, that's certainly a huge issue. Falls in elderly are a primary cause of concussion, which I did come across a lot in the literature, but not a whole lot of information about kind of the recovery process of that. I think that again, with that EDI, that's something that's really important to explore more in, because that's one of the populations that is, you know, heavily impacted by concussion. And obviously you don't need grandma out there riding on the stationary bike trying to get her heart rate up because she had a fall. Like, that's just not realistic. So I think it's still ongoing, and I can't necessarily speak to anything specific about it. Vanessa.
I have a question about sex differences in
Mm.
sports.
Mm.
Like, just like from what I know growing up, like playing sports, there's so many people who, like girls who got concussions, and I heard less about boys, but maybe that's because of like where I was playing and stuff.
I think there's a couple things. So there is a lot of research that's looking at whether or not girls are like, because you're not wrong. Girls do tend to have kind of more reported concussions, and I don't want to like say this for sure, but I'm pretty sure there's also kind of more severe concussions or like longer recovery for concussion. Again, I don't have the research right in front of me, so I can't remember exactly. And there are definitely sex differences, again, with the research, primarily male. So there's a lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of gaps that are currently in the research, even though this is such a huge issue. I mean, almost every single person in here put up their hand, they know someone who's had a concussion. So that's one of the things that they think they're exploring. Hormones might play a role in it. Actual neck muscles, like the strength of muscles. I remember coming across somebody who hypothesized that, you know, women's muscles might not be as strong, so they're more susceptible to concussion. But I don't know in terms of like the recovery, how those things differ. Yeah.
Do you know anything about MIPS tech and new helmets? Yeah, that can help prevent concussions better than your average.
Yeah. So I actually know about MIPS because I worked at a sports store. So that's the only reason I know what that is. MIPS stands for multi-impact something or other. And essentially it's a helmet that has a layer within it that's able to rotate. So when somebody crashes, their head isn't like being grabbed by the helmet and getting kind of that rotational impact. It's supposed to reduce the rotation that's felt. Maybe, I don't know exactly. There was an interesting TED talk that was done talking about kind of this, why helmets don't prevent concussion. And that's because what we talked about, the sort of rotational impact is what's so damaging. And helmets are really just meant to prevent more severe brain injuries, like actual open wound brain injuries. So I want to say like a little bit, but maybe not enough to be like, oh, I've got a MIPS helmet, so like I'm good. All right.
Was there any research that suggested better alternatives for preventing concussion in sport?
In concussion in sports, so there's a couple things being done. Youth soccer is banned like heading the ball. So that's one thing for a couple of reasons, because kids like don't know how to do it properly, and they're also neck muscles aren't very strong. So that's causing more concussions. And also you don't really need to be heading the ball in soccer at like this big. Another thing that rugby is doing is like tackle training. So making sure that people are effectively learning strategies for how to tackle. So those are some of the things I came across that were sports specific. Something that's really neat that I saw a video of, and it's not currently available in North America, but it's something that the Scandinavian countries are doing, is kind of this like helmet airbag. So I think it's a collar that people wear, and when they crash, it's kind of like those motorcycle backpacks that deflate, but it actually like wraps around your head and creates like an airbag to help prevent like, you know, to kind of cushion the blow and also prevent that like dramatic jolting and rotation that's happening. So those are a couple of things that are happening, but it's not like there's a helmet out there that will like absolutely prevent concussion, as we just talked about. And yeah.
I was just wondering if you could kind of go into more detail with diagnosing concussions.
Mm.
I know you mentioned sense symptoms, but those seem to all be subjective measures.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak on difference, like whether there are lab tests versus field tests, and then there are specific like sensitivities of the.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. Something I forgot to mention in my presentation is concussion is an invisible injury. And as of right now, we don't have the imaging technology to be able to detect it on standard imaging. So this is CT or MRI. It's just the detail isn't good enough to be able to detect those microstructural injuries. They are looking at DTI, diffuser tensor imaging, which of course looks at the flow of water along white matter tracks, whether or not that's an option. And also looking at blood biomarkers to see if there's anything. As of right now, those aren't reliable in diagnosing a concussion or being able to differentiate between someone normal and someone concussed. So they're still in kind of the working phases. In terms of actual assessment that's done, there's two things. There's something I actually should have had a slide prepared for this, but there's something called the SCAT-5, I should know what it stands for, but I don't remember right now. And then the CRT, the concussion recognition tool. So the concussion recognition tool is used by physicians, and the SCAT-5 can be used by trainers or coaches or someone as like an on-field assessment. And those involve doing like short tests, like memory testing. What else is there? There's kind of like a balancing that's done, and just finding out like what happened, how are you feeling? Like those really are kind of the major things that they use to diagnose concussion as of right now. Nancy?
Really cool. I was curious about the role of myelin. So if it's like an axonal injury, does myelin play a role in the protect axons against it? If you had an mass, would you be susceptible to severe concussion?
I love that concussion, that concussion. Oh, I've said that word so many times today. I love that question. The question was about myelin and whether or not in some neurodegenerative diseases of myelin, like MS, you can see maybe a greater risk for concussion. I don't know. That's not something that I thought about, but I'm going to write that down and look that up, because I think that's a great question and a super, super interesting kind of idea. Like, would you be more susceptible? I can imagine you would be. I think myelin plays an important role in insulating membrane. Of course, we know that myelin is chunked along, and we have these little gaps, these nodes, where the membrane is vulnerable to kind of this. So maybe that's where the shearing and tearing occurs, and myelinated areas don't receive as much injury, but I don't know that. And I'm definitely going to look that up. Yes, Dan.
So despite teaching neuroanatomy, I love reading also like cells.
Don't ask me about IELTS.
So, I will not ask that, but you kind of talked about a general neuron, right, with its cell body, dendrites, and axon, but we know that neurons are not the same. There's like
Yes. There's
a
late,
very
yes.
wide population of differences. Do you think there's certain things about, you talked about a few populations that might be susceptible?
Yeah.
Callosum,
Yeah.
the deep brain structures. But do you think that there are some things about neurons that might make certain populations more susceptible to injuries like this than others?
Populations of neurons specifically?
Or characteristics of neurons?
Oh, it's just really testing me.
This is a
Yeah. Okay.
kind of question.
Let's see. Well, there is, so there's a huge paper published called the Neurometabolic Cascade, which talks all about the things that are going on in the cell. I touched on like teeny little bit of it, and it talks all about kind of like inflammation and astrocytes and glial cells. So there are other cells that are impacted, that like freak out after they get injured. I focused on neurons because I think those are like, it's too bad because the glial cells are so important. They totally get left aside. They really don't deserve, like they don't receive the respect that they deserve. And I've learned a lot of really interesting things because the glial cells take care of the neurons, and the astrocytes, like they're so important in the whole system, but I don't know exactly what. Maybe if I read that paper again, I could tell you a little bit more. I kind of glossed over once we started talking about like, redox and all of these other things. I was like, no, neurons is what I care about. But I think that maybe that's something I could touch on in my paper. It's a good place that I could extrapolate further. Any other questions?
What was the progression criteria for I know you had all the different stages listed out.
Yeah.
First stage is like 48 hours, but
Yeah.
what is the criteria to move between stage?
Yeah, so once you achieve this mild and symptom, once you can do activity for an hour and not exacerbate those symptoms for more than 2 points, and maybe just like 1 point or a little bit, then you can kind of move on to the next stage. So this kind of mild and brief symptom exacerbation is the guiding principle to being able to progress to the next stages or move backwards.
So they are at a point working at or above that mild degree symptom exacerbation?
At or,
Because if they need to get to that point to
Mhm.
move on to the next stage,
Mhm.
are they working above that point at the current stage?
no, so you'll stop doing the activity if it's increasing more than 2 points. So the kind of the sweet spot is to fall in this sort of this range, no more than 2 point increase for no longer than an hour. So for example, let's say my headache is sitting at a level 3 and maybe I'm here. I start doing my activity. I've got my Apple Watch. I can see my heart rate because privileged. I can see my heart rate. And then I get to a point where maybe I'm at like 65% of my max heart rate and my headache has now gone to like a level 6 or level 7 after 30 minutes of exercise. That's probably a good indication that I should go back to no more than 55 of my kind of max heart rate being the aerobic threshold. And then if I can achieve this for an hour without going beyond this 2 point increase, then I can move on to the next stage. And there's a minimum of 24 hours between the stages. So that's kind of like a good gauge of where you can test yourself, like how much aerobic activity can I do? Oh shoot, I was gonna say something here about increasing, I don't remember, sorry.
And just follow up for the,
Mhm.
I know that we're using max heart rate as some of the criteria.
Yeah.
And then I guess you did mention that it was athlete specific. I was wondering
Yeah.
if you just touch on like the different heart rate responses for a given workload. Sorry, I guess it's a little.
The research that I've looked at and one of the kind of things that came out, this is kind of a protocol that has been followed for like a number of years now. The concussionist work group kind of was talking about this like 10 years ago, I think, and their not last conference, but one before. But before that, the athlete populations, I'm sorry, I can't speak to other populations because of the research. They did something called the Buffalo treadmill test. And so that was looking at an athlete's heart rate like threshold where they get to, I think it was a 3-point increase in symptom exacerbation. They like push the athlete really, really hard in a like short-term period, which I don't know if I like that, to see like at what point are you like not okay? Are you gonna like pass out? Or is this like, your symptoms are really bad? I know that sounds horrible. And so this is like done on a treadmill. I think maybe they do it on a bike as well. And then they determine that heart rate threshold. And then what they do is they start at, I don't know if it's necessarily 55%. And then there's like an increase of like 5 to 10 beats per minute, kind of over time. I don't know if it's like 1 week, you increase that by like 10 beats per minute until you get up to the amount. So I know that's like high performance athletes. This, I think you can generalize it and apply it to some populations. I couldn't tell you right now. I think heart rate for age predicted range is like, is it 220 minus your age? Yeah, I see some nods. So 55% of that, do the math. You're kind of like around 100 beats per minute. You don't want to go above that, which isn't that much. Like I could, yeah, right now my heart rate 124 1 minute ago. So so as you can tell, it's not hard to get that heart rate up to a point where maybe like you're increasing that blood flow to the brain. I don't know if that was kind of a roundabout. I kind of jumped around your question, but that's the information that I can provide you. Katie.
Yeah, just on the topic of the recovery scale, does a regression in the scale, so if you're at a 3, and you have to go back to a 2, does that mean that your injury is worsening? Like, is that a regression in the injury?
No, that's completely normal. Like the recovery really looks like this. You can definitely be feeling, I mean, it's like anything. You can feel great one day and worse the next, and that can be due to a whole range of things other than your concussion. So no, I wouldn't say, I mean, again, not a physician, don't know all the research, but personally from what I've read, I think it's completely normal to kind of be bouncing between these two to find that sweet spot of the amount of kind of aerobic activity that you can be doing. And it is completely common for people to be having persistent headache for a longer period of time. And there is a lot more research being done as to like, what's the cause of this? How can we like help it? And again, they're kind of looking at sort of the behavioral interventions that can happen. So what makes your symptoms worse? If you're like doing good one day and then you've got like meeting with your boss the next day and all of a sudden you've got this like raging headache. Maybe it's not your concussion and it's just like the stress from going to see your boss or something, you know, like that's just an example of things that might make the recovery seem like it's going backwards. But I think it's super important for people to know that it's not linear and it is not, you're not regressing backwards if you need to go backwards. It's completely normal because, you know, the mental game plays a huge role in recovery. And so you definitely don't want it to be like someone who's like, oh my gosh, I like didn't have a headache yesterday, high bike today, like I'm getting worse, not better. No, it's completely wrong.
Yeah, I also have a question about this scale. So obviously this is for athletes.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of variation in athletes.
Yeah.
And it's very like aerobic focused.
Yeah.
But there's some athletes that don't primarily train in like aerobics and who may also be susceptible to concussion.
So true.
Like certain positions in football or
Yeah.
or like weightlifters who might come from form.
Yeah, no, you're so
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 are there,
right.
like any like variations to this for like non-aerobic athletes, or is it just like very much the research is based on soccer, hockey, like
Yeah.
those kinds of things? Yeah.
Variation for non-aerobic. I do think that because NFL, NHL, FIFA, those are like where all of this kind of attention and research is being funded. A lot, not all, but a lot of research is being funded by these organizations. We are looking at athletes who are doing a lot more aerobic activity. So I would say that's probably a limitation in the EDI, that you're not including all athletes in this. You're not including all populations, all bodies, you know, even just like diversity of locations around the world. I think there should be more collaboration with, you know, kind of like other places and other research that's being done, because I think this is primarily North American, European kind of like focused and sports. But no, I think I don't know exactly, but I do think that's probably like a gap in the research. Sorry, a lot of these questions are like, it's a gap in the research. Couldn't tell you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Brady.
I'm gonna have to give her a master's degree.
Oh.
I think this is like the most questions I've ever seen in my life.
Reaching about like some physiology courses, I know
Oh.
there's some mention of like certain, kind of like the sodium potassium creates concentration gradient. And then,
Yes.
sodium potassium can act as like flow transports and anti-transports, for other ions and stuff.
You're testing me here.
I know you talked about, things like calcium going into the mitochondria.
Mhm.
And then also like it, impacting its ability to produce ATP. I was wondering if, 'cause I know there are certain like glucose transporters that
Yeah.
transport with sodium.
Yes.
Based off certain gradients and stuff like that.
Yes.
Is the like kind of rate limiting factor
Mhm.
of the ATP production, is it mainly due to the calcium inhibiting the mitochondria? Or is it, could also be impacted by the amount of glucose being transported as well?
Yes.
through chest?
Yes. I from the neurometabolic cascade paper, there are many factors that go into it. And again, we only touched on calcium, kind of glucose levels. We didn't touch on, there's like lactic acid that plays a role. Of course, your astrocytes and inflammation, like there's all these things that are contributing. And the research is, you know, it's like 30 years worth of research. Like the first public paper was published in 2001, and then they released like a new neurometabolic cascade, which is like more information in 2014. So it's just, they're always building upon that and the understanding. And there's a lot of complex processes going on. I don't know necessarily if one is more rate limiting than the other. I think they both play like a really important role. All right, I think that's good. There's tea and coffee in the back. Thank you so much to everyone on Zoom. I really do appreciate you coming, and to all of you here in person. We have the room for 3 more minutes, so please help yourself to Timbits and hot chocolate. The kettle maybe have to be plugged back in, but I do really appreciate all of your questions and all of your attention. Thanks, Zoom.